Good morning, class. Hey, it's Mr. Stewart, and this is going to be the Chapter 3 Integrity video for CRJ 130. I'm sorry that it's a little bit late this week, but of course, you know, we were off Monday, and so that kind of gave us a little bit of a late start. So I am going to be submitting this video to you today. It's Wednesday. At least it's a day before your main discussion posting is due. Chapter 3 has to do with the federal courts, and it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty self-explanatory, and there's a lot mentioned in your chapter that I'm not as concerned with you understanding as I am with you understanding just the basic structure of the federal criminal court. Now, you know, there's a lot of extra courts at the federal level there. I mean, as far as that don't handle the standard criminal cases, that may handle some very special type cases or specialty courts. Those are self-explanatory. You can read that, but I want to make sure you understand this whole idea of the way that the federal courts are set up. And the first thing I want to talk about is jurisdiction. And many students get confused, this whole idea of the federal system versus the state system, and how somebody might be able to be charged in both of those systems for the exact same offense. Well, understand that the federal courts deal with federal offenses. Those are crimes that are listed as crimes against the country or crimes against the federal government. Those are independent of state law. They are independent of crimes against the state or crimes against the people of a state. So theoretically, understand that you could commit a crime. That crime could be both a state crime and a federal crime, and you could theoretically be charged in both courts for the exact same offense if it was a parallel, what I consider to be a parallel offense. Most of the time you don't see that, though. You see that the state has a series of offenses that they charge in their courts, and the federal government has a series of offenses that are violations of federal law that they charge in their courts. So understand that we have what we call a dual, D-U-A-L, a dual court system here in the United States, which means we have the federal system, then each state and Washington, D.C. has their own system, and they work independent of the federal courts. So with that being said, the federal courts have jurisdiction over any federal law. The state courts cannot charge you in state court for violation of a federal law unless that is also a violation of a state law as well. So the federal courts have the sole jurisdiction of handling cases that have to do with violations of the federal law. Now, understand that as far as that, and that's what we would call subject matter jurisdiction. Now, the federal courts also have what we call geographical jurisdiction, which means the whole country, the 48 states here in the continental United States, plus Hawaii, Alaska, and any territories that the U.S. Is responsible for, such as like Puerto Rico. Is an example. Puerto Rico is still a territory of the United States. Maybe in your lifetime you might even see Puerto Rico become a state. I'm not sure they're at that point yet, but it is still a territory. Well, I think we even have a couple more territories that also that the federal court system has jurisdiction over, what we call geographical jurisdiction. And the difference between the federal geographical jurisdiction and the state is that, you know, in the state of Alabama, you get charged with, let's say, DUI in Alabama. You don't go to court in Nashville, Tennessee. But if you happen to have gotten charged with let's say, transporting drugs across state lines, and that was a federal offense, you might go to court in Nashville, Tennessee if you actually got arrested in Alabama by the DEA. You could. You may not, but you could. You know, both Alabama and Tennessee both have federal courthouses, but it just depends on where that investigation began and which particular courthouse the paperwork was filed in. So just understand that geographically the federal system has jurisdiction over anywhere in the country for a violation of federal law. Now, there are 3 tiers, and when I say tiers, I'm talking about levels of the federal court systems. At the lowest level, you have what we call the trial courts. and those are called the U.S. District Courts. That's where, if you get charged with a federal offense, that is where you will go to trial. Now, almost every state has at least one federal courthouse, so that if you get charged with a federal offense in that state, you'll probably go somewhere within that state for your federal trial. I believe it's in, I'm not sure if in Alabama, if it is in Montgomery or if it is in Birmingham, or possibly both. Tennessee has 3 federal courthouses because the state is so long. You have a federal courthouse in West Tennessee, you have one in Nashville, and you have one up in Greenville, Tennessee, which is East Tennessee. And they actually some of them even have some satellite courthouses, like there is a federal courthouse in Columbia, Tennessee, which is really not that far from us, about 60 miles or so. So just understand that the trial courts are going to be closer to being local to where you are if you get charged with a federal offense. If you get convicted at the federal system in federal court, you can appeal that, and we have what we call the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, those are not in each and every state. They are divided into kind of regions throughout the country. I'm not for sure about Alabama because I've never been involved in a federal case in Alabama, but I have been involved in several federal cases in Tennessee. And I know that in Tennessee, if you get convicted in federal court and you appeal it, you have to go have your appeal heard at the Federal Appeals Court in Cincinnati, Ohio. So there's usually a bit of traveling to be done at the appeals level of the federal court. You won't see an appeals court in each and every state, but every region of the country has an appeals court. And basically, the purpose of the appeals court is not to rehash the facts of the case, but it is to look at errors committed during the trial by the lower court. And what we look at is, were there errors committed? And if so, were those errors fatal to the case? Which means, if those errors had not been committed, would the jury have likely reached a different verdict? If the appeals court thinks that those errors were potentially fatal to the case, they have the ability to overturn a conviction. They can set aside the conviction and have you retried at the lower court again, or they can simply agree with the lower court and say, no, maybe there were some errors committed, but they weren't that bad, so you're still convicted. If you lose your appeal at the second tier, which is the U.S. Courts of Appeals, you have the option of petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court, or Supreme Court of the United States is what it's typically what it's been called. We also refer to that as SCOTUS, S-C-O-T-U-S, Supreme Court of the United States. That is the highest court anywhere in the United States. If you appeal your case to the Supreme Court and they hear it, which is actually very, very rare, then you still have the potential option for having your conviction overturned or set aside or remaining convicted. And I can tell you that if the Supreme Court says, we're not going to hear your case, you're done. If the Supreme Court hears your case and they tell you that you're still convicted, you're still done. Because there is no court higher than the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States is interesting because it also serves as the highest appeals level for any state court as well. So just to kind of give you an idea of how the state courts run, you have local trial courts. You can appeal that decision if you get convicted to the state appeals courts. If they turn down your appeal, you can appeal it to the state Supreme Court, and if they turn down your appeal, then you can petition SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, to hear your appeal. But that is still the end. The buck stops here, so to speak, with SCOTUS, because There is no court higher. Their decision is final. The only way a SCOTUS decision can be changed is through another Supreme Court decision, and typically with different or other justices. For example, something like the Roe versus Wade decision legalizing abortion could actually be overturned by a current Supreme Court, because the current justices on the Supreme Court are not the same justices that made that decision. They could go back and reinterpret that particular issue and say, no, that other Supreme Court was wrong. Here's the way it should be now. So that's kind of the way the Supreme Court works. Now, I also want to tell you for just a minute that I said the potential for having the Supreme Court hear your case is very rare. They probably get petitioned for 25,000 cases a year, and they only actually hear 25 to 30 cases. So, that's a very low percentage. The only way the Supreme Court of the United States will hear your case is if it has potential national implications, which means maybe the police did a bad search, and maybe this was the case that brought this to light, and that the police all over the country are doing bad searches just like that. The Supreme Court may see value in hearing your case at that point. And again, it's not necessarily over the facts of your case, but it's about errors committed at trial, or even errors committed by the police during the investigation. It basically has to do with procedure. Was proper procedure followed? And that's what led to your conviction. If proper procedure was not followed and you got convicted, then we say, well, that really wasn't fair to you, and you probably need a second chance. And so that's what the Supreme Court does, is if they find merit in the grounds for your appeal, they will set aside the conviction, they will send the case back to the lower court, and they will suggest to the lower court that they retry you. Now, they don't have to retry you, but they can. And because the Supreme Court has set aside the decision, double jeopardy also would not apply, which means you can be tried twice for the same offense, because the original conviction no longer exists. The Supreme Court has done away with that, so it's like that there has been no verdict in the case. They will hear the evidence again, try you again, probably with a different jury, and hopefully there will be no procedural errors that would be fatal to the case during that second trial. I have seen cases that have been overturned in appeal and retried on more than one occasion, and there was still grounds for an appeal with each one, and then finally the lower court said, we're done, we're just not going to try that case again. And when that happens, that effectively frees the defendant, and that case is over, simply because they don't want to go through that whole idea of a trial again. So just as a recap, the three levels or tiers of the federal courts are your U.S. district courts, that's your trials courts, the U.S. courts of appeals, which is your appeals courts, and then you have SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, which is the final court of last resort, so to speak. So I just want you to make sure you read through this chapter and understand those three levels or tiers of the federal court systems. Please make sure you read the history of the federal courts, including the Judiciary Act of 1789. That's on page 53 in your textbook. It's very important. And there's also the Courts of Appeals Act of 1891. It's also important. And then, of course, your text goes on to describe that it describes in detail the duties and responsibilities of the district courts, of the Courts of Appeals. It goes on to describe some of those specialty courts like bankruptcy courts. It talks about the caseload. And understand the caseload of the federal system is much, much less than the caseload in typical state courts, because there are fewer federal laws than there are state laws nationwide. And you have the courts pretty equally spaced out across the country, so their caseloads are manageable in the federal courts. And also, if you get convicted in federal court, you don't go to state prison, you go to federal prison, in which case you will serve probably in the neighborhood of over 70% of your sentence. So please make sure you read this chapter, and if you have questions, please reach out in regard to Supreme Court, Appeals Court, or District Court, or even any of those specialized courts. On page 67, make sure you read about Article 1 and Article 3 status in regard to the Constitution and Constitution courts. Also understand, some of you have been in the military, you will understand that the military has their own code of justice and their own military court systems called a courts martial. The UCMJ is a bit different than other federal laws. It's also something that doesn't necessarily go with you. If you get convicted under a violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and you go to military jail, which they have their own jails, and you get out of the military, you actually don't carry a felony conviction with you in most cases unless it is something very, very heinous. So just understand that it's kind of another parallel system that we have at the federal level. In your text, make sure you read the law and popular culture section on 69 and the case close-up on 71. It kind of gives you some pretty good real-world examples of these courts in action, and it talks about how they work and how the decisions are made, etc. There's also another one on page 75 called Debating Law, Courts and Politics. It also tells you maybe some of the problems in the federal court system. Other than that, I think if you can get a handle on just how the federal court system works, how their jurisdiction operates, and how that they are different from the state systems, I think you'll be in good shape for this particular chapter. I will try to get next week's Tegrity video posted on Monday instead of Wednesday, and I will be in last week's discussion boards this week responding, and I will be a little slow on grading this week due to the holiday. I'll try to get all that caught up at least by next week anyway. But if you have any questions, problems, concerns, or issues, please reach out to me. I'm here for you. And if you get confused on anything, you can always send me an email or give me a call in my office. Have a good week, guys, and I'll see you next week for the next lecture. Bye-bye.